Silverbend, Dakota Territory, November 1885. Winter here doesn't knock with white snowflakes. It arrives with the crackling of ice crushing the Missouri River, and with despair. Ada Lane strained with all her might, clinging tightly to the icy rope as the ferry lurched precariously in the raging current. The panicked cries of livestock pierced the fog. 2 cows slipped from the wooden deck, plunging into the dark water, taking with them half the hay that was Lane Ben's farm. The ferry reached shallow water. Ada's hands were bleeding, but the price to pay wasn't over yet. Milo Crowe's henchmen were waiting on shore, tossing down a debt notice colder than the biting wind. Ferry fees, hay transport fees, and a loan from the past. 72 hours was all Ada had left before the sheriff put her father's ferry land up for auction. They stood there, waiting for the collapse of a woman who had lost her last means of survival. But they were wrong. When the henchman disappeared from sight, Ada silently knelt at the edge of the icy water, picking up the broken main mooring rope. Her fingers traced the cut, a clean, sharp cut. It wasn't an accident. Someone wanted to take away this town's only lifeline before the river froze over. That afternoon, Ferry House Saloon was thick with the smell of cigar smoke, bootleg liquor, and a sense of resignation. The cattle herders whispered among themselves about the Lane family's debt until the sound of a door being pushed open silenced everything. Finn Cole entered. Rafe Pike, Milo Crowe's hound, immediately recognized his kind. He knew the man with the cold eyes hadn't come here just for a warm drink. In the corner, Milo Crowe sat, sipping whiskey like an uncrowned king. He didn't need to raise his voice to threaten, for every piece of land, every debtor in Silverbend was neatly tucked into his vest pocket.
Finn came to Crowe to demand a blood debt from the past, but Crowe only smiled. He reminded Finn that whether he liked it or not, a man who lived by guns and bullets had once been a perfect cog in this ruthless system.
Finn wanted to deny it, but the air in Silverbend carried an all too familiar smell. The smell of those blank papers that drove the poor to desperation. Rafe Pike's hand gently traced the holster of his gun. In Silverbend, anyone who wants to cross the river must pay Mr. Crowe. The silence was shattered when the pub door swung open once more. Finn looked back. It was Ada Lane, her hair matted with snow and sweat, clutching the severed ferry mooring rope, walking straight toward Milo Crowe's table. Ada threw the rope down on the table. The dry sound echoed like a declaration of war. She publicly accused Crowe of having his men destroy the ferry terminal.
Crowe didn't get angry. He calmly pushed a ledger and several red-stamped shipping receipts towards her.
The numbers on the paper coldly declared Ada owed him more than the value of her own life. Ada knew the receipts were forged. In her pocket was her father's worn-out notebook, recording every ferry trip, every real coin. But a notebook stained with dirt couldn't withstand the signature of a bribed sheriff. From the bar, Finn Cole gently pushed his whiskey glass aside. In a deep, husky voice, he offered a simple solution: a bullet for Rafe Pike. But Ada didn't blink, coldly refusing. She looked directly into the stranger's eyes, speaking each word clearly. A gunshot at this moment would be the perfect excuse for Crowe to frame her for rioting and legitimize the seizure of Lane Bend Ranch that very night. Finn frowned slightly. For the first time in his life, someone was telling him that his only talent was actually just a trap. Ada turned her back and walked out, disappearing into the pitch-black darkness of the approaching snowstorm. Finn stood still, his gaze unintentionally sweeping over the receipt Crowe had left behind on the table. A small symbol in the corner of the paper The familiar black seal that had been stamped on promissory notes years ago. The ones Finn had forced people to sign with blood and tears. Finn followed Ada into the blizzard, not as a protector, but as a ghost yearning to rediscover the past through a tattered ledger. At Lane Bend Ranch, the harshness of the frontier was revealed without concealment. The emaciated cattle shivered in the biting wind. Each water trough was covered in thick ice. The wooden fence swayed precariously, threatening to collapse under the weight of winter. The hay was running out, barely enough for a few days, while the supply wagon was still stuck on the other side of the river where the ferry had just been destroyed. But Ada didn't cry. She gritted her teeth, counting the livestock herself, mending each rein with her freezing hands, mentally calculating a plan to get the herd across the river before the ice sealed off all escape routes. Finn stood silently in the darkness. He had witnessed strong men succumb to far less severe adversities than this. Without explanation or boasting, Finn picked up the hammer. He silently repaired each wooden post of the fence. The harsh sound of steel striking rotten wood echoed steadily amidst the howling wind. Night fell. Inside the wooden house, dimly lit by a storm lamp, Ada opened her father's notebook. As her fingers turned the yellowed pages, Finn's eyes suddenly stopped at a hastily written line in the margin. "If I die at the ferry, find the man bearing Crowe's mark on those promissory notes." Ada keenly noticed the flicker of emotion in the gunman's eyes. She slammed the notebook shut, her voice strained as she demanded the truth. Under the flickering oil lamp, Finn was forced to reveal his past. He admitted that years ago, he had been a link in the exploitative network of the creditors. Finn didn't care about the numbers on paper. He simply stood behind the debt collectors, ensuring that small farmers trembled as they signed over their land. Ada's gaze was sharp as a knife. Her voice trembled, not from the cold, but from utter contempt. How many families have lost their homes just because of your silence? Finn couldn't answer. The silence that enveloped the room was heavier and more suffocating than the blizzard outside. Ada pointed to the door. She didn't want to receive pity from someone who had built their life on the ashes of others. But just as Finn was about to turn and step out into the snow, the door suddenly burst open. An old rancher stumbled in, his breath ragged from the cold. The old man brought bad news. Milo Crowe had tripled the ferry fare. Anyone who couldn't afford it would be permanently barred from taking their livestock across the river. Ada was stunned. She realized this wasn't just Lane Bend Ranch anymore. If they didn't act, every small ranch around Silver Bend would lose its livelihood before spring arrived. For Finn, the sins of the past were no longer distant ghosts. They were right before his eyes in the form of people about to lose their last homes. Suddenly, a gunshot ripped through the night. From outside the enclosure, a heavy thud echoed. The lead cow had just been shot. The stench of blood and the sound of gunfire triggered extreme panic. Hundreds of hooves pounded the frozen ground. The entire herd of cattle charged wildly toward the slippery bank of the river. His killer instinct kicked in. Finn drew his gun, his eyes blazing with a fierce determination to find the sniper in the darkness. He wanted blood for blood. But Ada lunged and grabbed his arm. If the cattle scattered into the stormy night, they would lose the farm. Even if he blasted the culprit to pieces, they had to mount their horses. There was no time for heroic gunfights. Finn galloped around the outer cliff, disregarding the deep snowdrifts, using his own horse as a living wall to keep the cattle from the abyss. In front, Ada rode her old lead horse, her father's whistling echoing. resolutely steering the surging torrent of flesh and bone. When a group of aggressive bulls attempted to break away from the herd, Finn didn't pull the trigger to kill. He pointed his gun at the sky. A series of deafening explosions rang out, forcefully turning the giant animals back into their orbits. They saved most of the livestock, but the price was exhaustion and precious life or death hours. Beside the carcass of the lead bull, Finn bent down and picked up a brass shell casing from the soft snow. A special kind of bullet, the kind Rafe Pike always loaded into his rifle. Ada watched Finn put the casing into his pocket. For the first time, she realized this man's gun could be used as a shield, rather than just a tool for death. But at that moment, Finn's eyes narrowed, directed towards the bend in the river. Through the thick snow, a flickering light from a storm lamp was moving away from the bank. Someone is towing away Silverbend's only ferry, right in the middle of the night. The howling wind on the frozen river couldn't drown out the faint groans from the ferry guard's hut. Finn and Ada rushed over, only to find the old ferryman slumped in a pool of blood, his breath coming in ragged plumes of white smoke. Before he passed out, the old man whispered a name: Rafe Pike. He had robbed the ferry and taken a copy of the Ferry House Saloon's ledger. But Ada knew her father would never bet his life on a single ledger. She knelt down, prying open the rotting wooden floorboards with a knife, and pulled out a rusty iron box hidden beneath the mud. Inside was the original ledger. The numbers didn't lie. It revealed the whole truth. Milo Crowe had inflated ferry fares for years, turning those stolen funds into legitimate debts that strangled the entire town. But the real darkness lies on the last page. Ada's fingers froze, her eyes fixed on the words her father had left behind. Finn Cole's name sat prominently on the list of henchmen who had forced a farmer to sign a promissory note. Right before the night, he hanged himself. Finn stood there, his broad shoulders slumped. He tried to explain, but between them, no words were clean enough to wash away a life. Ada trembled, not from fear, but from overwhelming rage. She bitterly realized that Finn wasn't just on the fringes of the darkness. He had once been a part of that exploitative system. Suddenly, the sound of galloping horses echoed from the path. A henchman tossed the new notice onto the snow and galloped away. The auction for Lane Bend Farm has been postponed by the sheriff to tomorrow dawn. Ada has only one night left. That night, in Lane Bend's log cabin, a rare warmth emanated from the weathered faces of the small ranchers. Ada stood before them, spreading out the map. Her plan was as sharp as ice. Get all the livestock across the ferry before dawn, steal back the copy of the ledger from the pub, and expose Crowe at the auction. But silence enveloped the room. The weather-beaten men bowed their heads. They feared Rafe's gun, the sheriff's power, and the loss of their meager remaining means of livelihood. From the shadows, Finn Cole emerged. His hand rested lightly on the butt of his rifle. In an emotionless voice, he offered a shortcut. Let him finish off Rafe Pike. The crowd held its breath, but Ada stepped forward, blocking Finn and the door. She knew that if he fired, Crowe would turn this attempt to protect the land into a riot and legitimize his oppression. The choice weighed heavily on Finn's shoulders. He could do what he was best at, settle it with blood, or leave. But looking into Ada's unwavering, unyielding eyes, Finn slowly lowered his hand from the gun holster. He chose to stay, not with violence, but with sweat. Finn turned and walked to the ferry dock, toiling in the snowstorm to reinforce each section of the mooring rope, preparing for the life or death river crossing. Ada watched his retreating figure. She had never forgiven Finn, but his staying now was the only act of atonement she needed. Just as hope began to flicker, a pungent burning smell assaulted her lungs. From outside the stable, a blazing red fire erupted, consuming the life-sustaining hay stockpile of Lane Bend Farm. The raging inferno devoured the snow-covered night. Hundreds of hay bales, the only thing keeping the cattle from freezing to death, were turning to ashes. Through the thick black smoke, Finn's cold eyes caught sight of Rafe Pike's retreating figure on horseback. His predatory instincts kicked in. Finn lunged at his horse, his grip on his Winchester rifle tightening, veins bulging on his forehead. He wanted to chase. "Stop!" Ada's shout ripped through the crackling flames. "If this hay bale burns down, the cattle that cross the river will starve for 3 days." Her words were like a knife cutting through Finn's bloodlust. The enemy was escaping, but life was burning right beneath his feet. Finn froze. A moment of internal struggle tore at his heart. Then he resolutely turned his back on Rafe's escape. He charged straight into the inferno. Together with Ada, the two frantically carried bundles of intact grass, throwing them beyond the boundaries of the licking flames. The thick smoke stung their eyes. The heat scorched their skin. Finn's coat caught fire, and his hands blistered from the red-hot barbed wire. As the flames died down, they saved a third of the grass. It was nothing, but enough to sustain a glimmer of life. In the dim light, Ada watched Finn gasp for breath, his hands bleeding. She deeply understood that for a gunman to abandon his chance at revenge and choose to plunge into the fire to save his livestock was a painful transformation. They had no time to rest. The entire herd had to be moved across the river tonight. But the darkness of the west never allowed hope to take root. From afar, the brass bells tied to the horses' necks rang out in a cold, steady rhythm. Jonah Voss, Crowe's most seasoned, cold-blooded, and ruthless executioner, has officially arrived in Silver Bend. The horse bells chimed coldly in the night. Jonah Voss loomed before the Lane Bend farmhouse, breathing death and carrying a confiscation order stamped with the sheriff's red seal. He wasn't as impulsive and boisterous as Rafe Pike. Jonah was a seasoned executioner, his dull eyes filled with a cruelty honed over time. When Jonah's gaze met Finn's, he saw his own youth. An arrogant man who believed the speed of a gun could silence the past. Following behind Jonah was Milo Crowe with his familiar smirk. He tossed a cruel deal to Ada. If she signed the papers relinquishing all the fairyland, he would drop the charges of falsifying records and allow her to keep the log cabin to survive the winter. If you refuse, the farm will be sold at dawn. All the livestock will be held here by the river to starve to death. And worse, the sheriff will immediately arrest Finn Cole for vandalism, arson, and witness intimidation. Silence suffocated the space. Ada bit her lip until it bled, forced into a cruel crossroads. Choose to save her father's estate or save the life of the gunman who had just rushed into the fire for her. But Finn wouldn't let her decide. Without a hint of resistance, he calmly extended his hands, allowing the sheriff's hands to snap the cold iron handcuffs onto his wrists.
He accepted being deprived of his freedom because he knew this network had crushed countless innocent people, partly because of his complicity years ago. As Finn was dragged past Ada, he tilted his head slightly, leaving behind a whisper lost in the snow and wind. "Don't save me. Save the ferry."
Ada stood motionless. Her heart pounded with unfamiliar rhythms. For the first time, she understood the sacrifice of someone willing to give up their life so that she could continue fighting. Before dawn broke, the blizzard raged, tearing at the roofs of Silverbend. But Ada didn't wait for anyone to rescue her. She did something neither Finn nor Milo Crowe could have predicted. She single-handedly pushed open the doors of the Ferry House Saloon and walked straight into the lion's den. Under her soaking wet cloak, Ada carefully hid her father's original ledger. But the most important page, containing the incriminating evidence against Crowe, she carefully sealed and concealed in the saddle outside. In front of the trembling ranchers drinking to drown their sorrows, Ada pulled up a chair and sat down opposite Crowe, feigning surrender to buy time. While Crowe triumphantly flipped through the pages of the transfer contract, Ada's sharp eyes darted towards the slightly ajar safe behind the bar. The stolen copy of the ferry ledger lay there. With a deep breath, Ada suddenly stood up, pulled out her father's original notebook, and slammed it down on the table. "No guns or bullets needed," she said, using the language they prided themselves on, numbers. She loudly and clearly read out each ferry code, each shipping date, codes only known to those directly involved in pulling the mooring ropes. She exposed the henchmen's stupidity on the spot when they altered the numbers but forgot to erase her father's weather markings. The farm owners in the tavern began to murmur. Their eyes shifted from resignation to suspicion, then to seething resentment as they realized they had been exploited for years. Rafe Pike realized the crowd was losing control. He knew this woman was stalling. With a curse, Rafe pulled out his pistol and pointed it directly at Ada's forehead. But just before his finger could pull the trigger, clang! A dry, metallic sound echoed from the front door. The broken handcuffs were tossed and rolled across the wooden floor. From within the swirling white snow, Finn Cole entered. Finn didn't charge in like a bloodthirsty killer. His arms hung limply, but the murderous intent in his eyes was enough to freeze the air in the tavern. At the same time, a shout from the riverbank shattered the tension. The last mooring rope of the ferry had been cut. The ferry, carrying a cart loaded with hay and the lead oxen, was drifting into the raging waters, on the verge of being crushed by the giant icebergs. The battle immediately split into two. Ada didn't hesitate. She left the tavern and dashed like an arrow to the riverbank, disregarding the danger to save the livelihood of the entire town. On the slippery, ice-covered wooden dock, Finn stood facing Jonah Voss. The old executioner smirked, his gun in hand, constantly hurling insults to force Finn to draw his weapon first. If Finn fired, he would extinguish the town's resistance under the guise of suppressing the rebellion. Finn understood. He looked at Jonah, his hand slowly leaving the gun's grip. He chose to abandon the weapon that had defined him. Bang! Jonah fired. The lead bullet ripped through Finn's left shoulder, blood gushing out and staining the snow red. But Finn didn't fall. Taking advantage of Jonah's moment of complacency, he lunged like a wild beast, grabbing the enormous iron hook used to anchor the ferry. With the strength of pent-up rage, Finn swung the iron hook, knocking the gun away and slamming Jonah to the frozen wooden floor. He wouldn't die, but would live to be a witness to Crowe's crimes. Out on the riverbank, Ada had jumped onto the rocking ferry, tearing through the ice spikes with both hands to reattach the auxiliary anchor rope. She strained to turn the wooden winch, her muscles aching from the weight of tons of flesh and ice. The farmers on shore watched a woman risking her life for all their livestock. Their cowardice shattered. They roared, plunging into the freezing water, grabbing the ropes to pull the ferry away from the jaws of death. Desperate, Milo Crowe grabbed an oil lamp, intending to throw it into the ledger on the table to destroy the evidence. But an old farmer pushed open the door, holding aloft the last page taken from Ada's saddle, the page bearing the black seal that incriminated Crowe and his entire system. Crowe was surrounded by the crowd.
He still sneered, arrogantly hissing that a pile of scraps of paper could not defeat money and the law.
Ada entered, soaking wet, blood dripping from her hands onto the wooden floor. She looked him straight in the eye, coldly replying, "No, but the whole town has heard the truth." The next morning, the blizzard finally subsided. The pale winter sunlight shone down on Silver Bend, revealing the remnants of a long night. The Lane Bend Ranch auction was permanently canceled. The sheriff was on the run. Rafe Pike had fled during the night, and Jonah Voss was tied to a horse-drawn carriage awaiting his federal judge. Herds of livestock slowly boarded the ferry, crossing the river that was beginning to freeze solid, heading towards the safe, low pastures on the other side. At the frigid dock, Ada stood stunned, staring at the wooden stake where the mooring rope had once been cut. Heavy footsteps echoed behind her. Finn Cole stood there, his left shoulder wrapped in a blood-stained white bandage. He was using his other hand to painstakingly braid a new cable. He said nothing about leaving. Ada didn't ask either. She stepped forward, handing the gunman a steaming cup of black coffee. The warmth spread through their scratched fingers. Looking out at the swirling water carrying large icebergs, Ada said calmly, "In Silver Bend, a man doesn't need to be the quickest to draw a gun." She paused, took a sip of coffee, her eyes shining with an unprecedented resilience and peace. "Just don't leave when the mooring rope breaks." Finn subtly curved his lips into a genuine smile. He turned, using his uninjured hand to tighten the knot on the wooden stake once more. Deep and secure. The frame receded. The sturdy wooden ferry cut through the water. The cattle grazed safely on the opposite bank. In the distance, from the chimney of Lane Bend Farm, a gentle white smoke rose against the winter sky. Finn and Ada stood side by side. No hugs, no handshakes needed. They simply gazed silently towards a roof, the place they had just reclaimed from the brink of death. Thank you for accompanying Finn and Ada through this blizzard. In the harsh Wild West, those who choose to stay are always the bravest. If this story resonates with you, hold on tight by clicking the subscribe button. There are still many fires waiting to be lit on the frontier. See you on the next trip.